I'm happy to connect what is happening today with gene drives and the new wave of genetic engineering with what happened in what you could call the first generation of genetic engineering back in the 1980s, 90s, and into the early 2000s. Because if there's something actually good about gene drives, it is that at least there is a recognition now of the uncontrollability of genetic engineering. Now we know that by releasing a genetically modified organism into the environment, we should not expect it to stay put, to stay in place. That was not the case with the first generation of genetic engineering. Back then, after the first release of genetically engineered crops in 1996, the industry and the promoters of genetic engineering claimed to have control, claimed to really know what they were doing, to know where they were putting their intervention, and to make sure that it wouldn't spread. It was something that was completely contrary to biological understanding. Anyone in biology could see that it was wrong as a statement, that it cannot be possible to constrain a living, reproducing life form. And yet it was accepted for policymaking, for reasons that have nothing to do with biology and everything to do with politics and economics. That context where industry and many people in academia were claiming that these genetically modified organisms could be contained, in that context, we were working, myself, my lab, and collaborators in other places were working together with indigenous communities in the southern state of Oaxaca in Mexico. And we had been working for many years on the intersection of indigenous rights, indigenous interests, and the new and developing powers of biological intervention, of which this genetic modification or transgenesis became a really central point. So the indigenous people that I was working with were asking themselves, okay, so you're telling us that people in the US, people in Europe are crossing maize, corn, with bacteria. And I said, yeah. Well, that's really strange, they would say, because that really shouldn't happen. We don't want our corn to be crossed with anything else. We want corn to be corn. And I said, well, yeah, okay. Then they would say, so how are we going to know when it comes, when this starts crossing with our corn, because we don't want it? And I would say, you won't know, because the corn is going to look the same, but it's going to be transformed internally. And this was a very serious problem for them. So they decided to set up a lab, and I helped them set up that lab, in which they could detect the presence of GMOs in their corn plants. Using the PCR reaction, at that time it was something relatively new, and so we helped them set up a lab that was at that time pretty much state of the art for doing microbiology and for doing DNA analysis. And very soon, as soon as they were able to do this, they detected the presence of genetically modified DNA within the plants that they thought were completely their own. And we in the US, in Europe, and everywhere else, we had held those places as the repository and origin of corn's diversity. This is the place where corn was first domesticated, where it was first brought into contact with humans, and one of the most important centers of diversification and diversity of corn. So having this genetic contamination coming from industrial corn and genetically modified corn into these crops was a big surprise for many. It was not really a surprise for us because, as I said, any biologist who knows anything about reproducing organisms would know that sooner or later they were going to cross. But for them, it was a big surprise. It was also a big surprise for the industry, who were not really expecting that anybody would be looking on the margins. They were prepared to fight battles and so on, here in the US especially. And they had the whole institutional setup to wage those battles, to defend themselves. But they were not expecting that in the periphery, in the edge, indigenous communities in a remote mountainous area in Mexico, that they would have the capacity to look and to find. And that's what surprised them, and that's what generated a huge amount of political debate. At a time, I have to say, it's the time when the Convention on Biological Diversity was having to decide what to do about national boundaries, national borders, with regards to genetic resources and with regards to genetic modification. So genetic engineering, biotechnology was coming to the place where they were deciding, okay, if you have a genetically modified crop, are you allowed to bring it across international borders or no? So the treaties that led eventually to the Cartagena Protocol and so on were just being conceived of, this idea that we needed to have some regulation. So the discovery of genetically modified corn in Oaxaca by the indigenously established lab and my lab together generated a huge amount of problems and really put a wrench in the machinery that was already moving towards deregulating the movement of seeds across international borders to allow biotechnology to spread all over the world. The discovery of genetically modified DNA inside the corn plants in Oaxaca was much more important for them in cultural, psychological, and in terms of their perception of themselves than any economic or political consideration, you might think. It's hard for anyone outside of that world to understand how deeply identified people are there with the corn, and not only the corn plant or the species, but actually the complex of species that come around their way of doing agriculture. The milpa, for example, the milpa agriculture, which is a very specific set of species, a very specific ecology that they have nurtured for 9,000, 10,000 years. It is the very same people today who back then, thousands of years ago, brought this corn into cultivation. And over that period of time, there has been this incredible identification. So the definition of who I am and who my people are is inseparable from the definition of the ecology and the mythology of corn. So humans are corn and corn is human. There's no question about that. So when we come as scientists, right, and we say, I have news for you. Corn has been contaminated from the inside in a way that you cannot see with your eyes, but will be passed on to future generations. When we came and we said that, we were committing an incredible trespass. The kind of news that this was led to what some people from there years later, many years later, told me. We're still in what you could best describe as collective depression from the news. Because there is nothing we can really do about it. We don't even have the resources to even know that this is being done. And it was the equivalent of me coming into your doorstep, you know, dressed up as a scientist, whatever that means, knock at your door and say, good morning. I have news for you. The Americans have put inside you a reproducing power that is now part of you and will be passed on to your descendants. That is the level of trespass that happened with this contamination of corn in Oaxaca. The intervention of genetic engineering, and specifically transgenesis, I think it's important to make that point. Transgenesis is an intervention that comes as the culmination of a way of understanding life, a way of understanding control over living things, and a way of acting in the world that comes from a very specific culture, of which the West, and within the West, the United States, and within the United States, California, represents the cutting edge. And this is meant in the real sense, the cutting of a weapon that is cutting a cultural weapon that cuts into other cultures, into other places, other ecologies, other psychologies, takes over psychological understandings, including this understanding of self, how individuals see themselves, human beings see themselves. So it's a cultural transformation. And so you can see transgenesis, this genetic engineering, as a very important module of a larger cultural intervention that includes the intervention that produces weaponry for warfare, that includes the intervention that produces surveillance, all of them tending to be concentrating and centralizing interventions. Some of them more technological, some of them more institutional, all of them cultural, right? And something important to recognize here is that other modules of this intervention, for example, the module of the intervention of nuclear physics into the material world that leads to nuclear power and also to the nuclear bomb, are of the same kind. The difference, though, here is that the intervention, the technical intervention of nuclear physics, is different from the technical intervention of biology because biology is different from physics. Because living things are not only material things. So the intervention that comes with the same mentality, with the same culture, into the living world, presuming that the living world is going to behave the same way as the material world responded to the imposition of the physics, that mentality is driving biotechnology from before 1996. You can go back to at least 1930 to see the history of biotechnology trying to push living things to behave like non-living things, like the material world. And the living world responding with a very strong sense of resistance, because the living world is not only non-living matter. So this culture that is pushing both the physics intervention into material science, nuclear power, and so on, very successfully, tries to insinuate itself into the world of the living unsuccessfully, and continues to butt its head against the living world that keeps pushing back and responding because it's not amenable to the same kind of intervention that happened into the material world. So it's interesting because it's at the same time the same kind of intervention, and at the same time an intervention that is not in the same way successful as the intervention of physics into the non-living world. The very act of making science and generating knowledge becomes engineered in the process of attempting to use knowledge to transform in a very specific way the world. This model is not new, and in the 20th century it really works for physics, in that new knowledge about the material world becomes very useful for very specific applications, mostly military, but eventually also other kinds of applications, but first from the military. And it starts really with radio and radar, but soon after radar becomes widely distributed among the military and used very effectively, the model comes into completion, really, in which you have knowledge production linked directly to the possibility of using that knowledge to intervene in the world. And then the other big element of that comes later on in the 20th century is that you turn that from usually a military application, which is of national importance, into a commercial interest that becomes now a civilian application that spreads throughout the world. And then you have the benefits of that for not only the individuals playing with it, but the institutions that are associated with those individuals, and then the nation state. The US utilized this model very effectively in the Second World War. So you can count really the beginning of a historical moment from the end of the Second World War, when this model was complete and brought to application everywhere. And the model is, let's find the next knowledge frontier, turn it into a technological frontier, use that for any application you can come up with to use commercially, and use that as the engine for progress, and not only progress for all, but dominance of that progress, economic progress, by the United States. So it's a very American kind of project. Works. So it works in these waves of new field of discovery, new field of technological development, new field of commercial application, and so on. The problem with this model is that you need to keep running. You need to keep moving this cycle over and over and over. Why? Because once you come up with a commercial application for it, you know that it's going to go away from you. It's going to get away from you. It's going to follow the path of least resistance to places with lower environmental and labor standards. So you see that very clearly, for example, with the computer industry, where the personal computer world comes out of here at Silicon Valley, but very soon it ends up in Southeast Asia, or first Japan and then other places. So it goes away because those places have lower environmental and lower labor standards. So this is a process that was well understood by the 1970s, 1980s, when the material science and technology was really leaking out of Silicon Valley and the US. The executive branch, the president of the US, understood this problem, and they called on the very same people who had brought the wave of development based on physics. The very same people were brought in to Washington and the White House, and they were asked, okay, so what is going to be the next development? And they said biotechnology. So it was a top-down decision. They said we must, because we're going to lose the preeminence worldwide that was brought to us by space travel and communications, space communications, material sciences, computer sciences, information technology, and so on. Each wave, we have been on the forefront. We're going to lose that. The next wave is going to be biotechnology. So from the top down, from the president of the US, the vice president, his name is Dan Quayle, he ran something called the Committee on Competitiveness that was tasked with maintaining the competitiveness, that means the leadership of the US in the world, mostly through biotechnological promotion. That is the foundational root for why biotechnology would spread around the world as a cultural and political development before it was even available as a biological development. And we are still today, 2022, we're still catching up with the imagination of Dan Quayle and George Bush, the father, as president of the US, who imagined that biotechnology was going to be really like the successor of computer science and space communications. It has never really reached that level, and we're still trying to find out one way of presenting it to the world that will materialize the kind of advantage that we gain from the other waves of technology. At this point, with so-called synthetic biology or gene editing or whatever you want to call the current wave, because they keep renaming this over and over and over, right? As if they were putting life into it again when they continue to fail to deliver on the promises they made. And you notice that the promises and the ideation, the ideas of how this is going to work, precede the actual physical work in the lab or in the field. As if the technicians, I'm not even going to call them scientists, the technicians are running behind the people with the ideas. Or we should be able to, I don't know, produce prettier babies, or we should be able to, whatever they dream of. And then the technicians behind them, many of them professors in this university and Stanford and so on, those people are running behind saying, okay, you said we would be doing that, there is money to do it, here, I'm going to do it. All you need to do is to promise something. So in this sense, biotechnology has always been science fiction, driven by science fiction. It's not as if you have this amazing discovery in the lab. Oh my gosh, I discovered something, and I can use it for something else. No, it's that you have this idea that you should be able to do something, and then you try to prove it that you can do it in the lab. So it's not even a science, it's not even a technology, and I can talk more about that. It's much more of a science fiction being imposed on the world as if we had the powers to do what science fiction says we should be doing. This has happened from the very beginning, and we can take 1972 as the beginning of genetic engineering, 1996, the release of genetically engineered crops. I jumped 1982, which is the first release of genetically engineered organisms that happened from this building out. But then 1996, by the year 2000, they had to rebrand themselves. Every time they need to change their names because they fail, because they cannot deliver to the standards of the science fiction that they are working towards. And instead of accepting defeat or saying, well, let's look back and see what happened, they say, no, no, no. We'll invent another frontier and promise that we will get to that frontier in the next 10 years and next 15 years. We're going to, you know, it happened in Switzerland, $2 billion going into a project to supposedly produce a completely artificial brain. Didn't work, but you don't hear about it. You heard when they were promising that they would do that, and when $2 billion from the public were given to this lab, and then you don't hear about how they failed. They continue to remake themselves. Now, the question I think you're asking is, how is that possible? How is it possible that you could get away with 50 years, 1972, 2022 is half a century of failure, and still get all of the credit, all of the money, all of the political attention, have open doors in Geneva, have open doors in Washington, D.C. How is that possible? It's only possible because of the cultural engineering, the cultural transformation that comes ahead of whatever intervention, whatever gene drives or whatever technical intervention might be. People are convinced that this is going to happen, that this has to happen. There's no stopping it. How many people say that? You cannot stand in front of it because there's no stopping it. It's a new technology that will never be stopped. When they do that, they really are utilizing the imagery of nuclear power, of telecommunications going up to satellites and coming down in such an amazingly reliable way, applying that to biology. So the transformation of the human perception of this, so the cultural transformation, the psychological transformation, happened before. And now they get away with simply saying, oh, this is going to be like the computer revolution. Well, it's not. This is going to be like the nuclear revolution. It's never been. If you take each one of those revolutions, if you want to call them revolutions, and I think they are, you know, the nuclear revolution is a massive transformation of the planet and humanity. Those revolutions from concept to application, so from concept of the nuclear bomb to practical application in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 30 years, more or less. From the concept of a computer that would be available to large numbers of people to the PC being the personal computer, another about 30 years. In biology, there's nothing today that would approach PC as the personal cloner, right? They wish that there would be such a thing, and they have actually talked about it that way. Like, we're going to reach a moment when individuals will be able to have a little machine in their house, come up with an idea of a life form that they want, you know, a yeast or a baby, who cares, or a fly or a dog, and then just feed it into the machine, feed the raw materials, and out will pop out a dog that you like. That imagination, that PC would be personal cloner, is there. There are people who would love to have that, and yet it doesn't happen. Half a century, really meager results, almost nothing, but incredible credit in the public imagination because there's been this massive engineering transformation of the institutions and, even more importantly, of the public's perception of what they want, who they are, and what their place is in the world. I think we lost a lot of effort fighting Monsanto. I'm going to say this, that sounds contradictory. I'm really glad that it was so clear that it was 5 players in the world who were evil and all they wanted was money and so on. That made it a lot easier to identify them and fight with them. But at the same time, we lost a huge amount of time thinking or acting as though it was only about money, as though it was only about greed and corporate power and so on. It's not. It is much deeper than that. And I honestly wish, and I tried, I really tried, and I continue to try. I honestly wish that we could have seen clearly at that time, as, you know, as a community, and stopped obsessing about this one player and realized that what was happening was that we were being transformed inside, and our children. And even in our fights against Monsanto, we were quoting them as saying, we're going to change the biological world. We have this power. And then we would say, oh, they have this power, they're going to use it for evil purposes. Instead of saying, no, you don't have that power. You shouldn't have that power. And actually, your manipulations of biology don't give you that power. This is not a technology that gives you that power. You're just faking it. And that kind of critique back in the 1990s and early 2000s was impossible. I really could never get across to, people who were opposing genetic engineering this idea, okay, let's fight it in the form of Monsanto, but at the same time, let's try to keep the focus on this cultural transformation that is happening. There's something really good to be said for gene drives in that they make this so absolutely clear. And again, gene drives, and gene editing, whatever you want to call it now, every time they come up with a new name, they have to recognize that the previous generation was wrong. It's very funny to see the same actors or their descendants say, oh yeah, what we did back in the 1990s was so bad. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't have control, but now we do. And it's funny that people would not realize how shallow that way of presenting themselves really is, because they've never known what they're doing. And in 5 years, we will have another name, another rebranding, and those people in 5 years are going to say, oh yeah, back then CRISPR was so wrong. In fact, they're already saying CRISPR has all these limitations, it's not good enough, but now we're going to have the new wave. So there is a definite paradox in all this, because even though what they say they will do doesn't work, what they actually do produces consequences that are beyond their control. So here I am saying they have never delivered on what they promised, but they have produced enough damage to make anybody worry, or we should be really concerned and really worried. And they should be stopped. This really should be the moment when we say, okay, enough. Let's stop it. Let's consider what the situation is. Make a sober analysis of what we're really proposing to do with the world, with ourselves, with the companion species that keep us alive, and then decide in a democratic way that we're going to move forward with what, limit what, and so on and so forth, making real policy. We don't seem to have that possibility. We don't seem to have the capacity for self-reflection and self-constraint to be able to evaluate in what I would represent as a scientific way. To apply science to this would really lead you to say, stop and think and analyze. We're way past science. This is long past the level of science. This is not science at all. What can we do? I think the only possibility that we have, and it will come, is that people really wake up from the dream of utopian techno solutions to problems that were generated by this very same technologies that were introduced 20 years ago. We keep stumbling from one problem to the other, thinking that we're going to find a techno solution to each one of the problems that we have generated from the previous technological intervention. So techno fixes to techno problems cannot possibly be the answer. There is a very different kind of analysis that I think many people do have access to, and that is the analysis of what we are not doing, the roads not taken. Because we have been so obsessed with this obsessive techno-utopian perspective, we have passed many opportunities of dealing with the world, not only the food world, but the world of all kinds of other biological species that we relate to in a very different way. We have models on how to do it. We have places where it's been very successfully applied. So waking up from the dream or nightmare of techno-utopianism and then developing the humility to understand those other ways of dealing with the world, will be the answer to this problem. I think there's no possibility that we will not get to that place. The only question is whether we get to that place through a catastrophe, a major disaster, without any intentionality, or whether we can move to that place intentionally in a careful way that allows us to avoid catastrophe and get to it faster. Because it is there, it is looking at us in the face, it's not difficult to see, and we will get to it because the way we are going is not going to be sustainable for very long. The institutional engineering and transformation from inside the institution, and that applies to economic institutions, political institutions, and definitely to the academic institution. That transformation has been going on for a long time and continues to become stronger and stronger, tighter and tighter. You get less and less space for dissent, less and less space for critical thinking and proper science, science that would actually question. That is true. That is true, and it is a tragedy. It is a tragedy for humanity because academia is a place where we as a society have put public resources, our resources in common, to maintain these walls, to pay my salary, to keep sending our young people to learn from us. So it's a very powerful place where transformation would be possible in the right direction. This is why I think the institutional transformation, the institutional takeover, focused very early on in the academic environment, because it's not just about getting a few patents here or getting a herbicide-resistant crop over there. It is about transforming the imagination of the next generation and generations to follow. So the cultural transformation through academic takeover is, in my mind, much more important than whatever is happening out in the agricultural field. Nevertheless, every time somebody works with a living thing, it can be a cell, it can be an insect, it can be a fungus, like in my case, it can be also social structures, which are also living things, biological systems. You come up with a clear understanding if you are humble enough to listen to what you're looking at, the insect, the social system, because it shouts at you once you're listening to it. It shouts at you there's something seriously wrong with that, and this is not the way it works. So I see, and I've seen over my decades in academia now, that over and over and over you see the resurgence of this doubt, this questioning, this saying there's something really wrong. And so I'm not optimistic, because the institution is set up to get rid of those people as soon as possible. That's really true. But I know that within academia or outside, no matter where, people have the capacity to develop the questioning necessary to first confront the techno-utopian dream or nightmare, and secondly, realize that there are real alternatives that need attention and need development. This is again my question. When will the force of that questioning be enough to overcome the internal transformation of our institutions? I don't really know. But it's going to happen only as a tandem transformation of everything, because political pressures, economic pressures on academia support this way of being of academia, and academic transformations support the transformations within the economic system and within the political system. So it's a self-fulfilling and self-reinforcing system of institutions that tend to maintain themselves until catastrophe hits. And I don't know what you think, but it's possible that we have crossed that line of catastrophe quite a while ago. And what we're dealing with now is a moment of reckoning with the inevitable need to stop this craziness and to start looking at what we didn't look, what we left behind, as all the opportunities that we still have to be different in the world. I think it might be important to say that, politicians and academicians are never the leaders. I think there's a big mistake and a big misunderstanding in the public perception that a politician is the person who tells, let's go this way, and will lead. And the same thing about a scientist or an academician. The academician is the person who will say, oh, I'm going to tell you how to be in the world, and then people will follow. It's not true. I think politicians and academicians are followers. They only move into, or I guess I should say, we only move into the spaces that are acceptable. In the case of academia, it's sadly the spaces where there are grants and funds, where papers are acceptable and so on. Our currency is actually very, very small, even though the questions are very large. So we follow. We follow, but who do we follow? We follow what people want, what people accept, what people demand. How do you make possible that the stopping is still on the table? Well, I think in the case of biotechnology, it was a different story for nuclear power. We have to be clear about that. There was, in the 1960s and 70s, enough resistance to the developments of nuclear power that it kept some kind of bounce to it. But in the end, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, and we have plenty of nuclear bombs and plenty of nuclear power plants in the world. So you could say, okay, that didn't quite succeed. I think it succeeded, but in a more subtle way. In the case of biology, though, in the case of biotechnology, a very different case, because I think that from 1996, and you could go back to 1982, from 1982 to this day, it's been a continuous process of approval, like slow process of, I wish it would be approved. And the claims of gene drives today, that they are now really controllable, that they are now really able to produce some kind of utopian biology in the world, are just a symptom of how much they recognize their incapacity to stop the resistance, not only by people, but by biological species as well. They propose to do something, they push as hard as they can, they bring all the power of the state, all the power of international organizations, and still it doesn't work. Mexico is a really good example. From that time, the year 2000, when we made public that there was this problem of contamination in Oaxaca, there's been a continuous resistance in the streets where people come out on the streets and say, we do not want this. We do not want transgenic corn in Mexico. Every year, the industry and the government, it doesn't matter who is in government, left, right, up, down, it doesn't matter. They always say what the American embassy tells them to say, which is, this year we're going to approve GMO corn in Mexico. They've been saying that since the year 2000. We're now 22 years later, and every year, social pressure and biological pressure from indigenous communities, from people in the streets in urban environments, from suburban people from outside, very different configurations of resistance come up every year. And so far, this slow approval process has not succeeded. So we've gained 22 years of success, and I believe it will continue to be like this for a long time. But it is an everyday kind of battle. It gets revisited because of this open-ended vision of utopian, techno-utopian benefits that just keeps becoming fresh again, over and over and over, no matter what. Ongoing battle, we keep winning, and yet it doesn't end. The damage of introduction of gene drive DNA and then release into the environment is most likely to be unpredictable damage. Once again, we come to this paradox. It is not what they say they're doing, it is what they're actually doing that they don't know that should have us concerned. We should worry not about what they're saying they're doing, we should worry about what we know they're doing, which is many things that nobody can predict. It makes it a little harder to fight against that, but that is really the real concern, not what they say they're doing. So introducing, a CRISPR construct, of course, will have worse consequences than introducing just an agrobacterium plasmid. But it is not the consequences of what they say is going to happen. It is the consequences of what is actually going to happen that they don't know and we don't know. I mean, we have to remember the gene editing of the 1970s was being done by people who really knew what they were doing. They were real molecular biologists, microbiologists, people like that. Because they failed to deliver on the utopian promises, the problem was passed, instead of listening to them who said, no, this is not going to work, this is out of our control, etc., etc., the problem was passed on to people who didn't know that much. And that process of just moving the problem to one group of people to another has now reached the level where so-called gene editing is being done by people who really don't know anything about biology. They're engineers. They know about how to run a fermenter. They know how to build an electric system of switches and condensers. And they think that they understand living things because they compare them to their models of engineering. But you push them into a corner, and they will usually admit, and they will say, well, that's what biologists tell me. This is how biology works. I'm just an engineer. So all this gene editing is being driven not by biologists, but by engineers.